All right. Well, let's give it like a minute or two more. Appreciate everyone joining. Figure we'll have a couple stragglers coming in here. And not, I guess they're not stragglers. It's literally 11 o'clock. So I guess they're right on time. Micah, you were early. Super early. Good for you, man.
Oh yeah, could you see? I want to make sure that I got in there. Sometimes the Zoom can be troubling.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. All right, good stuff. Well, listen, I'm gonna keep letting people in as we get going here. But good morning, everybody. My name's Scott Choppin. Thanks for joining. So today, Antonia is gonna join us. And good morning, Antonia. How are you?
Good. How are you, Scott?
Doing great, doing great. So the basis for this, as some of you probably saw, and Antonia put in her tweet, was that a guy, Multifamily Madness, had put a project of his somewhere back east up and asked people to give input on it. And so I had asked him, I actually know he's an anonymous account, but I actually know him offline. And I asked him if he wanted to use his project as a guinea pig to do what we're going to do today. He said it wasn't a good fit for him. So we came up with a different project, and probably in a way, maybe better for this call, since we're going to probably go fairly in depth on initial strategy and thinking about how approaching land deals can work. So I'm going to share a screen here. We are recording the call, so everybody will have access to it. We'll post it on the Real Estate Development 101 space, and then also we'll put it somewhere, either YouTube or Vimeo or someplace like that. So everybody will have access to it. I'm also going to do that for call number one. Call number one, it was all about basically strategy related to real estate development, operations, projects, management, strategic planning, and then how strategy fits with land selection and site programming, which we'll touch on that a little bit today as well. So Antonia, you want anything to begin? Just to, if you wanted
No,
to.
I mean, I don't know if you have anything specific that you want me to speak to ahead of the call. But
No, I mean, I think everybody's here because you made the announcement, but I'll just but yeah, no, it's good. So what the agenda, which I'll show here in a minute, would be, basically about 15 minutes for just, the initial portion, which would be strategy and talking about the site and, just some basics about that. And then the second half would be Antonia talking about building teams around projects. And then we're going to leave some time at the end. We're trying to do it 15, 15, and 30. I think we'll probably run a little bit long just because we got a lot of stuff to cover today. But I certainly am going to stay on as long as anybody wants to hang around and do Q&A. Frankly, that's the best part. All you guys will have great questions. And I think Antonia and I love doing that, probably more than anything. Certainly, I think I know I do. So anyways, good. Well, listen, so I'm going to share screen here. All right. So to start, I just wanted to show you guys the agenda, which we posted, but we'll talk, what I call the learning framework. I'll show you a little bit about that. And these are things to build background for you guys. So in other words, we could launch straight into, talking about the site, but my purpose is really to talk about like very fundamental components of the development process, and then drill down into certain sections of those. We're going to touch some early phases of the real estate development process, and I'll show you that in the learning framework here in a minute. And then we're going to talk about, the strategy of development of this particular site that we've selected, 1.6 acres in Norwalk, California, where we're based locally. Talk a little bit about high-level underwriting, really focusing on zoning. So like think of when you first look at a site, what are you thinking about? What's the zoning? How does that work inside your strategy? Is it go, no go? And then Antonia will talk about, design team, formation, team building strategies and tactics, and then construction, management strategy as well. And then we'll get to Q&A. So to begin with, let me talk about what I call the learning framework. And this is a concept that I thought up when I was like sort of in not the beginning of my career in real estate development, but partway into it, it finally dawned on me that learning real estate development, it's a very complex process, as Antonia said in her post. You know, you can't learn it from a book, and that's true. But what you do is you learn it from other human beings. You learn it in transmission of knowledge, either in the actual job, or if you're not in that career directly, how do you learn it? And so this learning framework is something I came up with, which is coherent with the real estate development business, because here's where it goes. When you first come into the business, either learning it for yourself, or if you have, you know, a career position in it, let's say you're assistant project manager, you're never going to be introduced to a project at the very beginning and then take it all the way through its, you know, steps over time. And so therefore you sort of have to figure out a methodology of learning it in this sort of disparate way that you do, right? The learning is disjointed is the way to describe it. So I came up with this learning framework, and the way the learning framework works is at the bottom in the writing, those are the fundamental component parts of every type of real estate development project. So any project, anywhere, any type, any product, anytime, any geography, nationally, internationally, that you'll have these component parts that are underlying all projects. And this is why it's so important. Like why I think this is such a critical part of what we do is that, and sorry for the blurriness here, guys, that you basically will have all these parts that you have to operate and manage, and they'll always be there. And then the specifics for each project will be specific to that location or project type or time in the market, et cetera. And so it goes from left to right. So you start with strategy, land act, design, et cetera, all the way to the far end on the right-hand side, which would be some final disposition model, which is either you're going to sell the project, or, you know, if you're going to hold it long term, you put a perm loan in place. Let me see if I can get this thing to get back to not being blurry here. I love YouTube. Bear with me here, guys. All right, we'll keep going. So these steps go in order, right? So I put strategy in the far left because that's one that a lot of people miss. As I advise people who are coming into the business, or if they ask for our help and, you know, managing projects, a lot of times they won't think about the strategy. They'll go, oh, I found a site and it's, you know, it's entitled for 50 apartment units, and like I want to buy it and go build it. And then I ask them why, like why that project, why this location, why that unit mix. And not everybody, but a lot of people, they just go, well, that's because that's what's there, right? And I'm oversimplifying these comments. So anyways, I won't go deep into any of these component parts in the real estate development 101 space, which is shown here. If you guys go to the classroom section, and then there's something called the ebook series, which is right here. And this is all free. This is all the stuff that we offer. You're going to see real estate development strategic planning. And I wrote a whole, like, you know, a few pages of strategy, but this is a way to think about it. I'm not going to cover it here, but the call number 1 that we'll post, that will have strategy in it. But that's basically the place to start, right? And then what we'll talk about today is basically sort of a little bit of strategy, like how we think of the site strategically, how we think of in the land act process, a little bit about design and underwriting and the zoning standpoint. And then what Antonio will cover will sort of be design, like team formation, part of the underwriting, because team formation is really critical for underwriting the deal. And then sort of CD production, plan check, entitlements would be where I would put that. And Antonio can, you know, talk, you know, more in depth about that. Okay. And then I'm going to stop every once in a while to check in. I won't do it yet. But you know, if you guys have questions, I would hold most of them to the end. If there's any sort of clarifying question, like, you know, I'm showing, you know, zoning and, you know, you don't understand like what you're looking at fundamentally, ask those kind of questions just so we can clarify where we're going. But I promise you at the end, you know, we'll get everybody, you know, their questions, you know, well answered. I can promise you that. So anyways, all right, let's go. So the site we're talking about is in Norwalk, California, not Norwalk, Connecticut. So this is West Coast, not East Coast. And it's a small site. It's 1.6 acres. And it says here, this is a LoopNet, ad, and part of what I'm going to do out of these knowledge calls. So one of the things that we'll do in these knowledge calls, we'll sort of take an individual practice, like sort of an action that we take, again, one of these fundamental component parts of LandAC as an example. But we use LoopNet and CoStar, and we use various other databases to find land. This one actually was found. I don't see him yet on the call, but Francis Moreno on my team is one of our guys in the LandAC division. And so he actually found this site as part of his research and looking at other sites in Norwalk. So basically the idea is this, is that we have the strategy that we've set. For us, the strategy is we build for rent townhome infill housing communities, and we call it workforce housing, and we named it Urban Townhouse, or UTH for short. And that's a multi-generational middle income build to rent townhouse product that specifically we developed, designed and innovated and developed in California, predominantly Southern California, although we'll move eventually into the Bay Area to make the statewide. So everything that I think about for this site is through the lens of this strategy. So again, I'm not going to get into strategic planning for you guys, but I want you to think about it. So I'm like sort of just giving you what our strategy looks like. And so our product is a 5-bedroom, 4-bath, 3-story townhouse unit with a 2-car garage at the ground floor. One of the bedroom bathrooms is on the ground floor to help it be much more multi-generational. Think of an in-law or grandparent who has mobility issues would live in that. And then the rest of the unit, has the rest of the bedrooms, kitchen, dining, pretty normal stuff. And for us, our sites develop at about 20 to 22 dwelling units per acre. So that's like when we approach a new site, we know immediately, because we've built numerous of these projects historically, that we can get very accurate on design, 20 to 22 the acre. And I'll give you a little bit of range because there's variability within, specific zoning parameters and certain locations. If we're out in the Inland Empire, for us in LA, LA Metro, that's Riverside and San Bernardino counties, will probably be a little less dense, maybe closer to the 20, maybe even a little bit below that. In a site like this, we'd go for like max density in our program. So it would be, more like the 21, 22, maybe even a little above that, but that's the general working range. So we know, right off the top of the, just simple math. I mean, this is literally how I work when we look at new sites. I take 1.6 acres times 22, and I know I can get 35.2 units. And of course, we're going to round up or down. So I would probably say this is a 36 unit project, which is pretty tiny in the context of, most institutional grade real estate project types. But I know immediately I'm thinking of this as a 36 unit project, and that has several key characteristics, why it's important. Does it fit in the zoning, right? Does it fit in the market? Like, what's the cost of the land? You'll note on this one, and I'll cover it later, there is no pricing given on this one. And then basically this is the marketing flyer. And so, brokers, you have to take everything that brokers put in their flyers with a grain of salt. I assume the lot size is correct, 1.6 acres, the zoning C3. I'll sort of assume that's right. Not always, though. I always check it, right? Trust but verify. It's on a major thoroughfare, Firestone Boulevard. For anybody who knows Los Angeles at all, is like one of the major streets. It's an east-west street that tags into the 605 freeway, which is sort of the southern end of southern central end of LA County. And then it's got a train track at the back. Chris Moore on Twitter asked, is there any sort of railroad interaction with the back of the site? There's not in this case. And then one thing to notice is it's not a square or rectangular site. And this is noteworthy because unusually configured sites like this one won't lay out as efficiently. Like the worst to lay out would be a triangular site. Like that's the toughest to lay out because the corners always, lose your efficiency on the unit count that you can get in. And while this isn't a triangle, whatever this geometric shape is, somebody will know better than me. It's got these triangular corners. Okay. And then just to give a little bit of context, this is the site location. So it's, I'll back out a little bit so you guys get a sense, but I mean, we're in the, okay. So we're in the middle of the LA basin is how we would call it. I mean, this is like smack middle of, LA Metro. City of Norwalk is sort of an older suburban marketplace, older suburban city. And that's actually where one of the places that we like to work strategically is we're not in central business districts or downtown areas, nor are we in the hardcore greenfield suburbs, where they're building housing as far as the eye can see. We like sites like this that are infill sites. Okay. And then here's a street view, classic Southern California, apartments across the way. This is a self-storage, as I recall. This is used to be like a 99-cent store, maybe 98-cent store. And then this is the site we're looking at right here. So any questions so far? Just orienting, and then we'll dig into a little bit of the detail here.
Scott, what about the parking too? Does the number of sites you think of, you underwrite for, like figure out a number of cars per unit, or what?
Yeah.
And you talking about structured parking here, or surface parking, or what?
Yeah. So Pete, that's a great question. Let's hold that one to the end, but simplistic, I'll answer it real quick just to, make sure you're oriented. Our 20 to 22 the acre assumes all the setbacks, or let me rephrase, assumes certain setbacks, certain open space, and certain parking ratios, which is basically 2.5 per each unit has 2 in an enclosed garage. So each townhouse unit has a fully enclosed private 2-car garage, and then all the associated, which is half space per unit guest. Any variance from that in setbacks and open space and parking standards, we would lose density if those increased, and gain density up to about 22 to the acre. But that's a great question. We can dig into that, more. We can go in depth on that. Okay, so from the flyer, and I'm going to keep track of time here, Antonio, so I don't go too long. It's C3 zoning. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about our process for researching zoning, because this is one of the things that I find when I get people have brought me sites. Obviously, any sophisticated developer is going to have their architect will do this. Maybe their land act people will do this. I always encourage people, particularly that are getting new into the business, always do the zoning research yourself. Like, you see it for yourself, because the architect's really good at it. But there may be things that you as the entrepreneur and the developer think of that the architect will, if you work with them long enough, they'll know how you work and they'll think of those kind of things. But I so often have found stuff that, just for that moment in time, I happened to read the footnote in the zoning standard and I was thinking about something like, let's say in California, we can add ADUs, accessory dwelling units. Like, that's a new thing. So I'm really at the cutting edge of, and I transmit that to our land act team, always sort of working with them. Hey, here's what we're thinking about, new ideas, new innovations. And then those roll into sort of the strategy and the, sort of the programmatic requirements of our land act process. So I'll sort of go from the beginning here. So one of the things I always do, I use Google a lot, and I do this all the time. After a while, you build a basis of bookmarks if you work in the same city over and over again. But I'll use 2 search terminologies to check zoning. One you see here, City of Norwalk, California GIS system. And then the other one that I'll use a lot is City of Norwalk Municipal Code. And I'm just going to cover these very quickly, so I realize I'm going fast. But basically, if you do if you do basically City of Norwalk GIS system, you're going to get usually the City of Norwalk or the city's website, Community Development Planning Division. That's this page right here. Sorry, oh, I was going to go through it. You guys here. Typical city, everyone looks different, but you're always going to see the same component parts. And the ones I want you to look at are, for California, we have something called general plans, which is sort of like an overview zoning characteristics, like sort of region, citywide sort of planning standards. And then we have the zoning map, which every city in the United States is going to have a zoning map. And then this one has check property zoning. Now, it doesn't say GIS or Geographic Information System, but I would encourage everybody to, if they're doing this and practicing this, use the GIS systems. And when you click that link, it says check property zoning, you go to this website, and then this will basically, you can search by address, and then it will pop open the zoning. I won't do it here, but what I will show you is the zoning map. That's one of the other links. And again, I won't drill deep into it, but our site sits like right here, and it happens to be C3 general commercial zone. Okay, and then I would go check the zoning. I would check the zoning. So municipal code. And this library Q Code US, and there's a couple other Muni Code websites. Every municipal code in the United States is on these databases. So we use them constantly. And in these zonings, you know, or municipal codes, zoning is always going to be like one of the last. Usually it's the very last, and this one it happens to not be. And so we'll look at commercial zones, C3 we'd looked at in the GIS or the zoning code. And then basically you'll have a whole bunch of things right here, permitted uses, and this sort of talk about this. And then let's see what we're going to do here. I'll go back here. So Francis on our team actually was nice enough to pull this up, and this is actually a different version of the zoning code. But this is what you want to look for. You want to look for what are the allowed uses in your site. And then for us, because we do 20 to the acre townhomes, we need to see that there's some sort of an allowance for residential use, even though it's a commercial zone. Normally commercial zones, I would say 80% of the time don't allow housing at all. We're in California where the cities have been getting beat up hard by the state to allow more housing because we're so supply constrained. And so more and more often you see cities go, yes, we're not going to change the zoning. It's still C3, but then they'll have, you know, down here, multifamily, you know, permitted by right in the C3 zone when part of the mixed use development. Okay. And so what starts to formulate is you go, okay, got this 1.6 acre site, residential is allowed. Mixed use is allowed when you do a conditional use permit with mix of uses. And so then that informs us that as we start to look at the site, we can see this major street. And then in our program, and I'll start to wrap it up here, you know, we do this 20 the acre, and we're really residential townhouse apartment developers. We are not retail guys. I will be the last to profess any knowledge about retail. But in this instance, because we know cities so often in California like mix of uses, they're really hanging on to the property taxes. We've formulated a live work style unit, which basically has a ground floor commercial frontage that we can design to front the street. And then our UTH units sort of sit above and behind it. And then the rest of the project behind that one is then all residential back, you know, to the back. So we'd have a frontage of units, you know, a couple driveways going in, frontage of units to give you the mix of uses, driveway behind it, and then we'd lay that out. Now, I did not lay this one out. And the reason I didn't lay it out is we love the site. This is a great infill location. It's in the middle of the metro area of Los Angeles. It's got decent freeway access. Norwalk is a good community, great for our workforce housing, you know, multi-generational working class families all over the place in Norwalk. The main problem is that this site is too expensive. So I use this site because it's one that we liked, that would work for our program and our strategy, but it ultimately didn't work because they want $6 million for the site, which is, you know, we're at 36 units on our zoning calculation or density calculation. We're paying around $75,000 a door right now for our workforce housing model in Los Angeles. And so 6 million is way, way above that. So I sort of took this off the list. This wasn't, you know, we'll track it, and over time our land act team will keep checking and see if they ever lower the price. But ultimately, basically, we couldn't make this one work. And so I thought it would be a good example of one I don't mind sharing. There's nothing, you know, too proprietary about sharing it with you guys. And then I'll stop there, and Antonio, I'll turn it over to you, and then we can get to Q&A after that.
Yeah, that's a great setup, Scott. I like how you went through the zoning. I think that's something that a lot of people could definitely benefit from learning how to do. And it's really something that you don't really learn how to do unless you kind of go through it. So I'm with you in that. I think everyone should really learn how to go through zoning. And I think the other really important thing, kind of related to the zoning, is understand what the processes are for conditional zoning or for rezoning. So let's say you find a lot in an area that, you know, seems to be changing. Let's say it used to be industrial and now the city or wherever you are, they want to make that area a little more residential. They'll be open to having rezoning processes, and some of them are written and some of them are not written. So sort of having that relationship with either planning or city council or whatever process, because every city has a different slightly different sort of way. It's either by council or by planning committee. But understanding what the zoning or rezoning, conditional zoning process looks like for wherever you're looking to buy or build is really helpful. Because it'll also give you, kind of going back to your whole conversation about strategy, for a lot of people that I work with, some of the sites that I've worked on are, the strategy is we buy commercial, we rezone to residential, and now all of a sudden we can put 120 units where otherwise it would have been like a 10,000 square foot commercial space. So, knowing that those things happen, understanding zoning changes in areas that you're working on, either forthcoming or recently implemented, is an edge. And so I highly, highly recommend people get familiar with it because it is something that can really affect strategy. So that's like kind of the first thing, and it ties nicely into going into team formation, because if it becomes part of your strategy that you need to rezone or that you need a conditional zoning, you're gonna have to hire a very different team than if you're just building as of right and you're not really going to push the envelope in terms of a legal process or planning a legal process. So for many places, if let's say you're going to be rezoning, it'll be super helpful to find who the best zoning attorneys are in your area. So that would be sort of the first person on the team that you'd probably want to get a hold of and begin to have those conversations. And so I always begin with, if you're going to rezone, or if there's any kind of zoning exciting stuff that you want to do, a zoning attorney would be the first stop for me. And from there, the first person that I always hire on a project is always the civil. So civil engineers are typically going to be the people who know everybody. They know the process. They can tell you, there's a floodplain or there's an issue. I would say hire typically civil during due diligence, just to do like a quick understanding of your curb cuts, like how do you access the site, how do you look at everything, what available utilities you have. Because also, if you're at any point looking to upsize in capacity some sort of way, where let's say you're rezoning a commercial into residential, or in this case, in this lot where there's maybe available utilities in the street, but you don't necessarily know if you have enough capacity for 36 units, which is what Scott would have been looking at. You got to have sort of those capacity letters from your utility companies, and generally your civil engineer would kind of be the first stop to understanding whether the area generally has enough capacity for something like that. So civil engineer always comes first. Once you understand your strategy in general, and I'm just going to use the 36 units as a really good basis for how I would do this, you begin looking at contractors, because this is going to be a major thing in terms of your underwriting. And in Scott's case, you guys self-perform, right? So yeah, so you guys have a little bit of an edge there. And I always talk about how most developers I know are not really great at self-performing. So, and we've had this conversation.
Yeah, Antonio highly recommends not to.
I highly recommend not to.
Right,
but
so.
Yeah, but the people who do it well and who've been doing it for a long time, like you guys, that's always my example of very few people are going to do it like you guys do. And so that's always why I recommend against it, especially if you're just getting into it. Do not self-perform your stuff. And at that point, you're going to want to talk to a few contractors. I would say at least 3 or 4 of them in the area. Get a general understanding of the price per square foot, the type of building you'd build here. How are you going to build in this area? What would you normally do? Would you do, what kind of foundations do you put in here? Is it piles? Is it going to be spread footings? Is it, or is it going to be PT slab on grade? What kind of water table are you looking at? And contractors that have built in the area are going to have that information for you. And how your foundations look and what building type you go with are going to have a major impact on your overall cost. And so that begins to then form again the strategy and how much and your pro forma and how much you're going to build for. So that would be sort of my third person to start speaking to. And I wouldn't hire anyone outright, but I would definitely begin making phone calls to contractors in the area that have built around there, that have built about the size that you're looking to build, just generally, and just say, hey, how much are you building per square foot? What building type are you doing? What kind of systems are you using? What HVAC do you typically see in these? And those conversations, I always tell people, every conversation is part of the job interview. So they're not just wildly helpful in terms of giving you a rough order magnitude understanding where your costs are going to be for construction, but they're also going to be really good at getting you acquainted with someone who may potentially end up being the person who spends the majority of the capital outlay for your project. So you
Mhm.
want to start having those conversations, and generally you're at least 18 months out before you're even building anything. Now you're talking to contractors. So that would sort of be the the third person. The fourth person would be the architect, and now you have data. So now you know if you have a floodplain. Now you know if you're going to do some funny zoning things. Now you know what construction type you generally want to be in, and that way it gives you enough information to retain an architect, and you actually have a basis for a proposal. So you're not just saying like, hey, I want to build a building, I don't know what I want to build. You're
Mhm.
saying, listen, I want to build 36 units of type 5 with a PT slab on grade, and we have a floodplain on this side, and the access needs to come from this road. And by the way, we're going to have to rezone for this reason, or we need to submit these things to the town or to the city. And this is what the schedule is going to look like. And so you're going to get a very different proposal than if you just approach an architect and you say, hey, like, I kind of want to build a building over here and I don't really know what I'm doing. So, and that also, what that allows you to do is to go to multiple architects and get multiple proposals. And then you're comparing apples to apples. You're saying exactly what you want. And then after you nail down like who your architect's going to be, the whole MEP and structural team follows. So generally, I like to get recommendations from the architect, because I want people working together who are comfortable working together. But at the same time, I want to make sure that I do get enough proposals where I have a pool, and it's not just anybody. It's not just anybody sort of that I picked up off the street. So or that the architect is like, their cousin, and they want them on the project. So I definitely like to get multiple proposals for all MEP and structural. And then the one thing that I like to do, that I always recommend everybody should do, even if you're a small shop, is that you hold all the MEP and structural contracts together, or that you hold them yourself rather than having the architect hold them. And a lot of people will push back against that, but there are several reasons I like to do that. Mostly so that you can control the deliverables. So if your mechanical engineer, electrical engineer are, not issuing things on time, contractually you have the right to withhold payment. And it's very difficult to do that if it's the architect holding the contract. So let's say the architect is doing their job, they're paying, they're doing everything well, but you pay the architect, yet the electrical or the mechanical isn't doing what they're supposed to be doing. The architects tend to just pass the payments through and pay everyone, and then now you have no leverage. Now you have people holding your job hostage. And so anyway, I always err on the side of controlling the contracts a little bit more closely and a little bit better. And it should also force you to make sure that all your contracts, all your contract language is simpatico, because sometimes people's contracts are, you'll have the architect's contract that it'll say, hey, this is the schedule. And then you'll have the mechanical engineer's contract and the schedule's totally different, or the durations are totally different. And so now you have a bit of a fight. Whereas if you're controlling all the contracts, you make sure, hey guys, this is what we need to follow. You have a little bit better handle on what's exactly going on. So that's sort of how I'd put the team together. That's kind of the general order. And then you'd basically go through the typical process where you follow schematic design, design development, and construction documents. And you want to make sure that you have your contractor doing at least some sort of pre-construction collaboration, I would say, towards the end of design development. You want to make sure that they start looking at your drawings, and that, what you're putting down is definitely the way that that things should be built in the area. You want to make sure that if there's any sort of opportunity for value engineering, or for perhaps being more efficient in the way you design your systems, you want to catch that when you're still in design development. You don't want to start construction documents. And the thing that is really important about design development that I think everyone should, can benefit from knowing, is that design development is really the moment where all of the trades coordinate. So your mechanical, electrical, plumbing, your structural, they all get coordinated during design development, and that's the architect's job. So the architect should always coordinate, even if you're holding the contracts. So super, super important. You want to make sure your building isn't fully coordinated, and then you're going to go and redesign all your systems, because that's an ad service. And more importantly, it's going to mean you're would have wasted a few months at best. So definitely want to have your general contractor on board in some sort of pre-con collaboration manner during design development, the end of design development. And what you do that, you want to make sure you have very specific deliverables and very specific things you want them to do. So it's not just like, hey, Bob, sit at this meeting and tell me if you think we're doing good or not. It's like, no, like you want very specific deliverables from them during very specific time frames. So you say, hey, look, like 6 weeks into it, I want a report. I want you to sit in weekly meetings. And again, when you come to them and you say, hey, these are my asks for a proposal for pre-con, it's going to be a very different conversation than if you say, hey, you want to just hang out during our like, owner architect calls and like, just tell me if I'm crazy. Like you want to be very structured about what you're asking them to do. The expectations need to be clear. So that's kind of when the contractor should come on board. And then obviously, the process of leading up to construction documents and from construction documents into bid and construction. The process that I like to follow that I think is really the gold standard for commercial work is a GMP. And that means it's a guaranteed maximum price. And so that process takes a long time because the way that I like to do it, and again, this is a total spectrum. So there are multiple ways of doing this. And again, these contracts are very lengthy. There are lots of terms. And so there isn't one single way. But I'll just kind of put out the way that I like to do it the best. And obviously within that, we've negotiated any number of things. What I like to do is the only way that I will agree to sign to a GMP amendment is once more than 80% of the job has been bought. That means signed contracts with subcontractors. So not bids, not promises, not budgets, but signed bids. So a lot of people will say, well, how are you signing subcontractor bids if you haven't signed your GMP? And so what I do is you sign a construction management agreement. So you sign a CMA, and then that allows the contractor to begin entering into subcontracts with the trades. And then once you've entered into enough subcontracts with the trades, leading up to about 80% of the job or more, depending on the type of job, I like to see between 80 and 95, depending on what we're doing. And then once you've signed up that percentage and everyone is comfortable to say, okay, well, the remaining is super clear to us and we can guarantee we're not going to pass that, then you shake hands and you amend your agreement into a GMP. And so what you're doing in your CMA is generally coming up with all the terms, like what are your change order terms? Like what are you going to do your contingency? What are you, how do you, what's the markup and the fee? How are your general conditions defined? And you want to make sure to have all of those conversations leading up to and through the end of construction documents. So you have a bunch of time to have all these discussions. And that way, when construction documents are ready and you begin purchasing your subcontracts, you're not having conversations about like, what's the change order term or whatever. You're instead focusing on descoping and actually purchasing the subcontracts. So that's kind of how I like to do it. It's not that complex, and once you've done it, it sort of makes, in my mind, a lot of sense. But again, it's a spectrum, and so everyone can kind of manage that differently depending on how you do it. So the original CMA is going to be a cost plus agreement, and what that will also allow the contractor to do is if you have any sort of advanced work that you need to do, like in some cases you can begin doing civil or foundations ahead of your full building. It will basically let the contractor enter into subcontracts with the civil, and the civil can mobilize and be on site while you're still sussing out like your plumbing or your framing or your other stuff. So a lot of people will say, oh, well, if you wait to do that to sign a GMP, then aren't you delaying your construction? And I always tell people like, not necessarily. And if you understand really contract structure and how that works, then you know that there are plenty of tools available to ensure that you're not wasting time. So that's kind of how I would approach it. And then how you begin from there into construction is just managing the process very tightly. I think keeping a really good eye on the accounting for the construction is the way we do it. And we use that eye on the accounting as a project management tool rather than like as a pure accounting thing. It's not like it's very, very little relationship with finance and more a relationship with what's the progress of the job. And so we manage that through an anticipated cost report, which is a typical industry standard for how we manage construction. We watch that very closely. We ensure that every change order is per contract, because sometimes people will say, hey, well, this is a change order. And you're like, well, no, it's not. And by the way, you shouldn't be charging me 15% on change orders. It's only 10. And if you know your contracts, you know to do that. So we watch that very closely. And then every pay application, we watch it very closely. And then we see the job towards, until we finish. And again, like some of the really important things as you finish a project are understanding the terms of substantial completion. That means different things for different people. And that can tend to be like a major point of contention. So thinking through the future of a project as you are doing your contract is a really good way of ensuring that you're having those fair weather conversations early on. And that you're not ending up like, hey, I think you're substantially complete. And the contractor saying like, well, that's not what the contract says. Like substantial completion means you get a certificate of occupancy. But hey, by the way, like, I don't know, your windows are not, finally trimmed. And so you're like, well, you can occupy the building, but like it looks like hell. So I think really ensuring that those things are defined in the agreement are also really important. So always looking forward, looking how the project would end, looking what turnover looks like to ownership. Those are kind of the major things that I think of when I'm doing construction agreements. And I think anybody can benefit from at least asking those questions. Like, what does it look like when I get the keys to the building? So very, very quickly, but that's how we put together the team and how we generally look at contracts and construction.
It's good stuff, Antonio. I think of this, this level of learning, it's like drinking from a fire hose. We're
Oh yeah.
jamming a lot at you guys.
Yeah.
Let me just add one thing. Well, like when we're thinking about architects and civil and vendors, and then, folks who are working in the construction teams, we're always looking for people specifically have experience in that particular product category. This is a thing I see a lot, where, I had a friend who was doing a podium project. So think parking structure below grade with units on top. And he wanted to bring his, high level, coastal architect friend onto the project. And that was a bad mismatch. And so I always encourage people like be very specific and clear when you're hiring these vendors that they have experience in your particular, product type, geography. You're not going to pull a civil from Texas out to California and vice versa. That won't work. And, people try to do that. Architects, maybe, if you're high level site planning, schematics, initial design, there's, translates somewhat geographically. Okay. Like our architect that we use almost exclusively is up and down the entire state of California. And we'll even take in other states, as necessary. So, well, good. Thanks, Antonio. That was amazing. Super thorough.
It was a lot.
Yeah, tons of stuff. All right, guys. Well, let's do this. We're 11:43. Antonio is with us until noon. So let's get into questions. I know we had a couple in the chat box, but who's got first question? Let's open this up.
I'd love to ask one.
Hey, good morning.
Antonio, you talked about you don't GC in-house, but you also talked about asking your architect for recommendations on subs and then talking to the subs early on in the pre-dev time. So do you often bring the subs that you have talked to and like to the GC, or do you usually rely on the GC to have the sub conversations? If that makes any sense?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So a bit of a clarification there, though. I meant the MEP team, like the mechanical, electrical, plumbing engineers. So they're the people who are going to be designing. Those are the people
Gotcha.
that I like to get
Yeah.
from the architect. I like to get their feedback on who they like to work with on the design side. However, West Coast, it's very, very common, especially actually the size project, and Scott and I spoke about this a little bit. It's very, very common to have design build when you're doing projects in the West Coast. And I think I've done work all over the country. I would say that's a big generalization, but it tends to sort of be true. So there may be obviously some exceptions. So in the West Coast, design build subs, typically MEP, they have their own design departments. And so it's a little bit tricky because it means that if you're hiring someone to design your mechanical, electrical, plumbing, you're also hiring them for the job. And so now you're not going through, you're kind of foregoing a competitive bid process, which then how do you get around that? And so if your project is large enough, I would say generally separate the two contracts. That's kind of what I tell people, separate the design build and tell them you don't have the build. You'll have like a good crack at it and you'll know it better than anyone else. So you have the best shot at winning the job. However, you don't have it. Like, and being super clear and having those conversations early on is really the name of the game. Like with any of these things, if you're ever concerned that, hey, if we do this, it's going to be unfair. If we do this, I'm worried we're not going to have a competitive bid. You need to have those conversations immediately. You don't wait. You're not shy about it. So
does it put you at risk at all when you go to hire the actual MEP that they're now having to perform the work on someone else's engineering, and they might, do they think I got to put some extra dollars in here in case something's wrong, or they just tag that with the change order or something?
So it depends, right? Ideally you want to hire, and that mostly happens in the case when you have design build, where you would say, oh, someone designed this in a manner that we wouldn't build it. In the East Coast, it's very, very common, especially if you have the bigger projects in the East Coast. You have a full mechanical, electrical, plumbing, engineering team. And then you have subs that don't have design, and they can help you VE, but later on. So you just have to be super careful in understanding the full situation. And I think it's a little bit tricky to answer without like a specific project in mind. But I would say you definitely, if you're ever in a design build area, I would definitely separate it out and just be very clear. Like you're not default getting it. You're not getting it, but you're not default getting it. So you better design this in a way that anybody reasonable can build it. And not only that, but like you need to be able to build it too, and you need to be comfortable with it. So if you're, I find that if you're that straightforward from the beginning, people tend to work with you because it's like they understand your perspective because you're sharing it. The problem is when people don't share their perspective, and then the other person doesn't understand them, and then they're like, well, why are we fighting? It's like, well, I can't read your mind. So that's sort of the thinking there. And in terms of your other question about like suggesting subs to GCs, I mean, in some areas, like when I do work in New York, I do have preferred subs that I've worked with in the past. And I just make sure that they get a competitive shot. Sometimes I feel like someone might be better for the job, but at the end of the day, the contractor is the one who's in charge of the schedule. And if they can't manage their subs and if they don't have a good relationship with them, I can't be like, hey, use this guy, and then the guy turns out to be completely incompetent, and then now it's really my fault that my schedule is screwed up. So you also have to be,
they'll be mad at you.
Exactly. So you have to be super aware of that and being careful with it. So if you're making a suggestion, it better be for the good of the project, and it better not be your cousin. So that's
Love it.
Yeah.
All right, who else? Thanks, Jared. Appreciate the question.
I had a high level question for you, Scott.
Yeah.
When you mentioned strategy, how do you pick what cities you want to work in? Like, the site was in Norwalk, but why that over any of the other cities in LA?
Yeah, so part of your strategy is going to be like, what product category are you building? So as an example, are you building stack flat apartments, 1 and 2 bedrooms, or studios, right? Maybe in a mid-rise or high-rise build situation, like you've determined that's your market. So that's only going to go in certain places, like the market demand for studios in a high-rise situation is only going to be in, like, say, downtown locations, right? Or somewhere there's walkable neighborhoods where density makes sense, density already exists, like it's coherent with the market. For our workforce housing townhouse models, like we gravitate towards families and roommate groups. And so we're going to typically pick locations. In fact, I've named it urbanized suburbs, which are sort of in between your central downtown sort of location and your true suburbs. These would be older infill neighborhoods. Most of LA Basin is, would be fit under this category. And so we're looking for places where families would want to live, right? So they drive cars. So, you know, they're using transit. The propensity to use transit our families is more, but they still have some cars. So you can't have no cars. You'd have close schools close by. We want to be commutable within certain distances. That's one of the, you know, main reasons our families choose to locate in a place like Norwalk. So if you look at Norwalk, it's central in the LA basin, so it's commutable almost everywhere. Although our average commute doesn't go beyond 20 minutes classically. So people are tending to like find housing that's close to or co-located with their work situation. And then the choices of those pairings of product type and locations that are coherent are infinite. And so that's why you have to spend time in the front end strategically. You know, give you an example. I advised a guy who's working on something in like North Carolina, South Carolina, and his plan was 100 units. And he showed it to me, and he had all 2 bedrooms. All 100 units were 2 bedrooms. And I was like, why did you do that? Like, I mean, it appeared to me unusual, like you wouldn't have so much of a concentration, but I didn't understand the logic. He goes, oh, well, I did the research and that's what there's the most of already. And I told him, no, that's actually go the opposite direction. You want to find the gap in the marketplace where this markets or the development industry is not serving the market, and you don't want to compete with the majority of units in the housing stock. And maybe you'd have some new 2 bedrooms, but you might want to have some 1s and 3s to balance it out and be serving other parts of the market. I mean, we're always looking for the gap in the market. Where is the market not serving a housing type? That's why we do the 5-bedroom. It's insanely differentiated. But given the demographics and incomes and economics in California, we have a lot of working class families that don't have access to housing. Thanks, Matthew.
Anthony, a quick question before you have to head out here. You mentioned foundation type is going to have major implications on overall project costs. Can you go really quickly from cheapest foundation type to most expensive?
So your cheapest foundation type is probably going to be either a slab on grade, which again, caveat to that, because depending on how your soil situation is, that slab on grade might end up being like a super fat slab, and so not super inexpensive. But if, let's say, you're doing like an 8-inch slab on grade or a 5-inch slab on grade, you know, 2-way rebar, that's super easy. I would say that's probably your least expensive. And then again, you know, that's going to vary greatly if you have like frost levels, how deep do you have to go? Like it can get, you know, so take that with a grain of salt.
Mm-hmm.
Most expensive, probably friction piles. So if you're doing, for example, you're building in Hudson Yards in New York, you're having to drive piles a few hundred feet, either until you hit bedrock or until you have enough friction from the surrounding soil on the piles. And that is, I mean, between the fabrication of the piles, the driving the piles, the boring the holes, not only in terms of material, but in terms of time, it's your most expensive, most difficult to engineer. And generally, if you're doing it, if you're ever working on a project that would warrant having friction piles, you're probably building a very large project, I would assume, just because of the economics, very tall. And so it's very likely that you're like in the few $100 million, billion-dollar project world. Like that's the only place. Or if you're building in like Venice, right? Like Venice, not California, Venice, like Venice, Italy, where that's all, you know, some floating, but there's a lot of friction piles there.
High water table would be.
Yep.
Yeah. And then
exactly.
Mark, to add, you know, you're really going to lean heavily on your soils engineer and your structural engineer to guide you. So your job as the developer is to just, you know, question their choice to make sure it's cost efficient. You'll do that in concert with your GC and the foundation sub. You want to ask the whole team, is this the right design? And like have them, you know, fight a little bit, right? Like, you know, have your foundation sub and your structural guy. Like, you know, we did a project where it was not a very tall project, but it had 36-inch drilled poured, you know, piles. Antonio, you love this. Not even friction piles. I should have done friction piles. And it was, and, there was like 3 feet or 2 feet in between each of the 36-inch piles, and
Oh,
there was
man.
like hundreds of them. And
Yeah.
I came in, I was like, what the heck is this? It was marshy land. It was in San Luis Obispo in California. And I was like, dude, and the developer didn't know. He didn't question it. And so the idea is like, just question it. You're not there to beat everybody up, but just go, is this the
Yeah.
right choice? Is this 36-inch pile poured, high water table, crazy, soft soil? So, it's sort of like you always want to be, I call it paranoid, right? Where you're just thinking about
Yeah.
it. Is this the right choice? Is this the only choice? Are there other choices? And what are their cost impacts? And what's
Yeah, and Scott, to your point about other choices, even when you are in a situation like marshy land, for example, there are multiple ways. So you're rarely ever in a situation where there's only one way to do a foundation. Rarely.
Yeah.
So when you say, okay, what other ways could we do this, and walk me through them, and how crazy are they? Like if we're gonna do like bathtub, which is sort of like the way that we build in New York, where you have a pressure slab, and then you have like soil nails and a soil nail wall, and then you do a dewatering, and then you build a bathtub, and then that's the foundation you have. Or you could do friction piles. Like those are maybe your two options as an example, right? So it's always good to say, to Scott's point, hey, like what other ways could I do this, and walk me through it, and how crazy is it? And that's how you're gonna learn too, because next time that you see a project with that similar crazy pile situation, you're like, no, like isn't there another way, and can we get a price on it, can we talk through it? So
Yeah,
that's
this
a
is where,
really big
and also local knowledge comes in here. Like, the guy in New York knows the different choices, and they know like 10 times more than any of us sitting here on this call. And we look to them and go, what do you think? And what's the best choice?
Yeah, 100%. And also too, like what are they comfortable building? Because there may be a less expensive option, but nobody actually knows how to do it.
Yeah,
And that
no
happens
subs
actually.
for it. That's true, right? Yeah.
That's for not just foundations, that's for really any construction method.
Yeah.
Like sometimes
Yeah.
there are things that are less expensive than I've done in some markets, and I will get to a market and they're like, I literally had one market where the guy was like, we don't do stucco here. And I was like, why? And he's like, well, we don't know how.
Yeah.
So we had no choice but to do EFIS on that building.
Yeah.
And that had nothing to do with, like, we had no choice. Like, it was just like, this is what it is. And so
Yeah.
it's also why it's important to start talking to contractors early on, because those sort of circumstances are the things that are going to be affecting a lot of your pricing, which then goes into your performance strategy. So things to keep in mind.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Appreciate it. Who else? Got a couple more minutes for.
I got a quick question for. Oh,
yeah, go for it.
No, go ahead, Marshall.
all right, thanks. I've got a question for Antonio, just kind of zooming in on the GC process. I mean, obviously you talked about while you're in the middle of design, talking to 3 or 4 contractors, just getting a general square foot pricing. But could you talk about just the zoomed in timeline a little bit of actually getting competitive bids from those 3-4 groups? I assume that's with a fully CD set, and then you pick one to go into that CMA cost plus, and then you're really just like on one GC from there. But could you just kind of get into the detail of that timeline a little bit, and how that might interact with your SD and DD and
Yeah, for sure.
process from then on?
So typically, I always tell people, leave yourself between 8 and 12 weeks to interview and hire a GC. And that's from the moment that you start talking to the moment that you make your decision. That does not include your contract negotiation. So, and work backwards from there. Generally, I like to start talking to groups during design development or earlier. Like I start talking to them early on, and just like, who are you? What are your qualifications? Like, what does your team look like? Basic interview stuff that I find a lot of people don't do. Oftentimes, I usually start, if let's just $100 million project, I'm going to be talking to 5 to 7 groups. Very quickly, by the time I get to design development, I'm probably only going to be talking to 3 or 4 of them. Just because either they're not qualified or their response time isn't great. Maybe they're rude to my team. Maybe they don't seem to be easy to work with. They're going to get dropped off. So by then I'm talking to 3 to 4 teams. And then I basically start exercising them a little bit and trying to figure out what their relationships with subs are. Like, can these guys get real market information? Do they have, I mean, some of them have it outright versus some have to go fishing for it. And obviously that's going to give you more data in terms of their qualifications. Because what I'm really looking for is this person going to be able to pull it off? Because at the end of the day, like if you're working in like a strong market that has enough subs, all you're really negotiating is the contractor's fee. Everything else, like the subcontracts, are essentially going to be the same between one GC or the other. You know what I mean? Like the plumbing is going to be about the same. It's really going to be a mix of like the fee and how good they are at performing. So generally, I'm talking to them, you know, at the beginning, like at the end of schematic design, through design development. By the time I get to the middle or to the end of design development, I'm only talking to, you know, 3 or 4. And at that point, I actually start asking for them to put together proposals with budget and schedule estimates. So notice the word is estimates, not bids. And then we basically look at those proposals, and those proposals will be updated through at different instances during construction documents. So we'll have generally a schedule, budget estimate at the beginning of construction documents. We'll have one at like 50%. And then we'll basically ask for sort of, I don't like saying best and final, but we like asking for like a, you know, sharpened up and ready to go bid proposal. Again, it's still a proposal by the end of construction documents, because you don't want to, you know, you don't want that gap to be that big. So that's generally how I like to do it. And you have to be super careful understanding your overall schedule and where you are in terms of your construction start. And a lot of that can get really complicated because for most people, you'll also have a construction loan that you're going to have to be negotiating during this time, and you have to weave it into, you can't close on that construction loan until you have a signed construction agreement. And so it can get really tricky. So it has to work together. But I always tell people, you know, from beginning of the process to when you make your decision, give yourself 8 to 12 weeks to hire a GC. You should be asking that many questions. It shouldn't be like, hey, you know, the guy down the street built a great project. Like, you know, let's build me this building. And here's $50 million, by the way, to a total stranger. So
Earlier, the better. Earlier.
Yes.
Yeah. Gotcha. Hey, Antonio, just keeping track of time, 12:02.
Yes.
So I know
I gotta run, but any questions that you guys have, like, send them over. We'd love to sort of keep it going. And if we share this link, maybe we could put some more questions underneath it. I'm always happy to answer them. You guys know where to find me. But this was super. Love it.
Where
Scott,
do we
thank you
send
so
them,
much.
Antonio? On Twitter or where?
Yeah, Twitter. Put him up.
Yeah, so
Okay.
there's we'll share back out, both of us, the sort of the original Twitter thread.
Yeah.
That's probably a good place. And then I'm going to post this on YouTube, so that's a place to go as well.
Yeah, love
Thanks,
it.
Antonia.
Thanks so
Appreciate it.
much, Scott.
Yeah.
Thank you guys. It was great chatting with you all.
Yeah. Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Antonia.
Merry Christmas.
You too. Bye, guys.
Bye.
All right, who else? Elaine, you had a question about the 98-cent store. Would we buy that next door if we could? Sure. We're always open to try to expand land areas, but doing assemblage where you have to do multiple sales and multiple purchases is challenging. Land assemblage is a 4-letter word, as they say in the development world. So we'd certainly do that. So who else? Who else got questions?
Scott, in the beginning, you did the math for how many units you can fit on that lot. You did, I think you did acres times, what was the math?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways to think about it. So we typically use dwelling units per acre. So that 20 to 22 was the number of dwelling units per acre. So you just do 20 times whatever the land area is in acreage terms. The other way to do it is to that 22 to the acre equates roughly to about 2,000 square feet of land area per unit. So I can do the math the other way. So let's say, you know, I have, 1.6 acres times 43,560. So it's 69,000 square feet for this site we looked at today, divided by 2,000. And I get, 34.8, slightly different math, but generally roughly the same math. But I always use dwelling units per acre. And that's when you're talking to an architect and you're designing something, you can ask him, hey, what's the dwelling units per acre on this? we do the same unit type over and over and over again, like, within different size projects. So we'll go, 50 unit project of this 5-bedroom product, or we'll do 100. So the math is like average of dwelling units per acre over several project designs, sort of come down to one, small range of numbers that we can then apply. So it takes into account like, dozens of scenarios of either land plans that we've done or projects that we've actually executed on.
Thank you.
Scott, so will you not look at areas that are, say, like zone 45 dwelling units per acre because the land value is usually too high than what you guys can justify buying?
Great question. We'll always look at it. And your logic is correct. The values don't always exactly equate to the density. There is a structural connection, mechanical connection. Often where you see that, Mark, is what the price the land seller thinks they should get versus what the market actually bears, right? Like we run into this all the time. So that, they'll go, oh, I got 500 units to the acre. So this thing's worth, $80 million. And you're like, I can't build 500 to the acre. I can't build that economically. And so like right now we're having a conversation where in Southern California, I think there's a lot of major metro markets, a podium style building, think like 4 or 5 stories of stick built over a parking structure beneath it, either on grade or below grade parking, a podium. The zoning works great for that. And a lot of those projects were happening 2 years ago, but today they don't underwrite anymore, right? Like the construction's too expensive, the rents haven't caught up, interest rates are high, values are dropping. And so that's put a lot of those types of projects out to pasture from a feasibility standpoint. And so this is giving us a unique opportunity because our is lower density, but we're a less expensive, more efficient way to build given our 3-story townhouses. And so we can still make deals work in certain locations and certain types of sites. And then when we show up, often they're like, hey, 45 to the acre. And we go, we're doing 20. And they go, oh, we don't even want to think about that. And I go, well, let me get a chance to offer you and see how that compares to the podium guys. One of the things to remember is that although you can get more density on it at 45 to the acre versus 20 to the acre, the per unit value the podium guy at 45 to the acre can pay is less per unit, although it's not more units. And so that dwelling unit per acre and that price per unit math, it changes. A less expensive, lower density can pay more per unit for land, although it's getting less units. And then podium is a lot more units, but a lot lower per unit valuation or sale price in that configuration.
Okay. To that point, you had mentioned a 75K per unit valuation. How did you guys as a firm land on that?
Just a lot, underwrite hundreds and hundreds of deals and underwriting deals all the time. And so the underwriting is only as good as what the market conditions are today. So what construction costs, what rents, what fees per unit, soft cost, valuations, interest rates, all those variables, plus a bunch more go into it. So we just know from the last, let's say 3 to 5 deals that we've underwritten in the LA basin and LA County that, given rents and given construction costs, and we can pay so much for land. In fact, the technique is called the residual land value, or RLV. So basically you're solving for all the other variables, and the last one you solve for is land. And so you just size the land price based on all the other variables. And so you don't always do it that way. So like this one, I didn't even have to look at Norwalk. I knew it was, 200 to the, 200 per door, whatever the 6 million divided by 36 is. I know that's, more than double what we could pay. So I know that is easy math. And I try to get through it very quickly. Like with our land act team, they'll bring sites or I find stuff myself. And we just try to filter it very quickly. It's got topo, it's on a hillside, it's a dirty site, the zoning doesn't work. We're just like saying, no 80 to 90% of the time. So we can get through and then spend time with the stuff that does, make sense or is at least closer in that parameter.
Okay. So when you see like double the value of what you guys can pay, I know I saw your post about crazy land sellers, a couple weeks back. Is that just the case where you're like, hey, this just isn't worth our time?
Yeah, it is. That's why I put it in the tracking, bucket. We just sort of track it because we know land sellers and their brokers, if they're not sophisticated land brokers, will always overprice. I mean, maybe 1 out of 10, you might see it underpriced. That happens occasionally, but rare. But we'll also know that land sellers are like, here's my joke, is they're the first to capture upside and the last to capture downside, right? So if a land market falls, land sellers are like, no, dude, I got an offer from a year ago. And I'm like, dude, that's like ancient, times. Like, here's the market now. And they never believe us, by the way, Mark. It's like, they think we're as crazy as they are. The way to think of it. And so you just track it over time. You keep pinging the broker. Hey, I know you guys were at 6 and, we're still around. Let us know if something changes. Cause at some point, sellers may decide that they need to lower the price because they got to transact. They'll get realistic. So, it's like the total spectrum from guys, I know I track sites that have been tracking for 10 years. They're still the same price. And obviously over 10 years, that the inflation should change that, but usually the bump in the price up, we see that sometimes. So
Awesome. Thank you.
yeah, you got it. Who else?
On
Question.
pre-development cost for
Sorry,
this site, what generally would you be looking at?
Yeah, so I think I could just answer it generically. I mean, most pre-dev, like think due diligence. I'll answer it that way, Daryl. Most due diligence for like a site to do a soils report, to do a phase 1, to do some preliminary analysis with the architect, sort of get enough to underwrite it, maybe a market study. The size of the site has like not a lot to do with the underlying due diligence costs. Like a phase 1 is the same, whether it's a 10-acre site or a 1-acre site. Soils, you might do a few more borings, but it's all relative terms. I don't know. Every company has a different, mode of how they think of it. Here's where I'll answer. Big institutional development companies or REITs or, they'll spend a lot more money. So I have like even people we're partners with, they'll spend, $500 to $1 million, not on a 1-acre site, but, something bigger, let's say. Like we on the other end, we've just, because we do so much of it, we've gotten really, really efficient and accurate. I could underwrite a site like this for due diligence at like 50K. Now, if you talk to an institutional guy, he would think that was crazy. But I know the market so well, Daryl, that I don't have to do a market study. I can do my own rent comparable analysis because we had a project, 2 miles away and, 2 blocks away. And we've done, 4 projects over time in that city. And that's not every city, but like Norwalk is right next to Long Beach, is next to Paramount. And I've done several projects in that location. So I don't need to do a market study. So I can dispense with that cost. As we now have we have 2 private equity funds. When you do a fund, you have, more obligations of how to underwrite a project. So those costs are going up. So I would probably say we're tracking 100K, 150K per site.
And is that to get you 2 entitlements, or is that just
that's not including entitlements? That's only DD. So just enough to underwrite and approve the site. That does not include escrow deposits or escrow pass-throughs for land. Think like, escrow deposits and not, non-refundable, pass-through money, post due diligence. If you were to include entitlement, then it's an open book because, one site's by right has all zoning and we don't have to do any actual entitlements, meaning governmental discretionary approvals, planning commission, city council. And other end of the spectrum in California is you have a full general plan amendment, rezone, EIR under our California Environmental Quality Act. Like that's like sort of like a NEPA nationwide, but an environmental impact analysis. I've talked to people that are spending tens of millions of dollars if you have a really big, long project in the entitlement phase, and that's much more variable as a function of, and you could have a site that's, a simple zoning process, but the neighbors decide to fight you, right? Like I talked to somebody who has a project up in the north part of LA County in a city called La Cañada, and they've been fighting the city and council and NIMBYs for 10 years. I mean, you could easily spend, hundreds of thousands of dollars, doing all the stuff you got to do. So one of the things we think about is, how challenging is the political environment? That's one of our underwriting parameters. If it's deeply challenging, but we want to take it on, then we'll increase that entitlement budget, maybe even including legal costs like lawsuits and or legal review. That's becoming a more common cost function in California. all the way down to, you know, we work on stuff in our hometown of Long Beach, you know, we do, you know, just the basic soils phase 1. You know, our architect will do some site planning for free because we do so much volume with him. I don't do a market study, so I could do that for, you know, that 50K number. Does that answer your question, Daryl?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I know it depends.
Yeah.
but,
Yeah, it depends, right?
but
Yeah, I
I
didn't want
I-
to
I guess
answer it
for
that way.
for that specific site, I thought it might be interesting to dig
Yeah.
into that and present that as a.
Yeah, I think that would be a 50K, and then given the conditional use permit, I think you're spending probably 100 to 150K on the conditional use permit entitlement process.
Sounds
That's
about
what conditional use permits, like one of the lighter duty, still
Mhm.
discretionary, but on
Mhm.
the low level of, you know, like intensity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gotcha. All right, who else?
I had a question about the overall process, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go for it. That's why we're here.
I find the biggest challenge is obviously everything takes so long, and there's so many different entities that have to touch a development to make it successful, and everything is temporary in nature, but every group wants things finalized
Yeah.
in a you know, a permanent format. And it would be hard enough. The biggest challenge is that you know, you have conditional bids. You have, you know, you may be talking to a bank, but nothing will happen until a bunch of things are finalized, and it takes so long.
Yeah.
It'd be hard enough if like the macro environment didn't change, but inevitably in a 12-month period, something's gonna change on the macro level that causes everything else to change. And then you have to go back and address the change with each individual party, and each change begets another change. How do you deal with the constant flux of all that and
Yeah.
making all the different groups happy? Like, you know, each of those individual groups once things finalized and not change. And then that's not even talking about going and getting and raising the money, you know. It may have made sense until the bank increased their rate by a percentage point, and you haven't even raised the money yet. Anyway, what are your
Yeah.
thoughts on how you deal with the temporary nature of everything, but needing like hard and fast things to deliver
Yeah.
to the different groups?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, this goes to the heart of the development business, you know, which you recognize. So one of the things to think about is, you know, as you do it enough, and, you know, particularly as you learn, you start to figure out what are priority questions to address and information to gather and questions and answers to firm up, right? So that's like one of the things on here is underwriting and due diligence, and due diligence would come under underwriting. Due diligence is that initial investigation of very important threshold questions to address that if they come back bad or no, you don't go any further, right? So like, I'll give you an example. Phase 1 environmental assessment is a, you know, research and sometimes field information tool to see if you have leaking tanks, or if you had a dry cleaner on site, or is there some sort of like petroleum or chemical impact on the site, or, you know, pesticides or chemicals, anything that would preclude you from developing the site. If that comes back dirty, then you're done. Like, I mean, there's people who develop those sites, so I'll qualify it that way. But like for us, if it's a dirty site, we're gonna move on. And so there's a sort of early, mid, and late stages of those items that you need to clarify, firm up, and get answered. And so that's why that, you know, that pursuit cost or due diligence cost is the most important money. That's the hardest. Like if you're a new developer, or you're like growing your company, that initial due diligence money is the most dear, because it's the most at risk, because you could get a phase 1 tomorrow, and all the work you did in that due diligence phase is, you know, done. Like if it's a no, then that's a sunk cost, meaning you've expended it, you're not going to get it back. So then, you know, let's say it's yes. Okay, then you got to go on to the next phase. So this is why I have the framework up here, because this ordering is part of your guide of what to answer first. Now, there's a lot of detail. These are fundamental component parts. So there's tons and tons of, you know, underlying knowledge and data information under each of these sections. And so then but then let's say like you start to go through the process, then you'll start to think about money flow, right? And so, money flow in, tying up land, escrow deposits, money flow to pay for due diligence. That's the hardest money to get. That's the most at risk. Then the next step is you go, okay, I've passed due diligence. I've got some initial underwriting and, I've talked with the city. They like the plan. For us, then we then go start to have conversations with investors and lenders at the same time. And I don't name it in here. In fact, I got to amend this, but that capital raising process sort of comes in that, land act design underwriting phase, that it sort of fits inside there. And is before the construction loan. In fact, equity is usually the first we go to talk to, because if you talk to equity and they don't like the underwriting of the deal, including the due diligence and the pro forma that you ran, then you won't go any further from that standpoint. So the way I think of it is
just to be clear, at that point in time, you're still probably like how many months from closing on a loan with the bank, typically,
when you're raising equity, or like
when you've had the initial conversation, when you're in the middle of underwriting. I guess my point is, I've done this so many times where I've talked to banks and everyone says they want to do, oh yeah, we love that deal. And they'll even like look at it a little bit. Oh yeah, we love it. And then it's 6 months to a year before we're even going to close on that. And now it doesn't look like it looked like before. Maybe not materially different, but they find something that, is different. And then it's like you're having to redo the process again with them. So I didn't know if that was,
so that happened to you where you had to really look from a bank and then you came back and that was different, or they can change their mind too. Is that what happened to you, Jared?
Yeah, well, I started trying to build a hotel right before COVID hit, right? So I mean, then COVID hit and everyone completely quit lending hospitality, and we, managed to weather that storm, and now we're getting through it. And then there's a war in Ukraine, and it's like banks are the skittish people on the planet. And every time something happens, they have to just say, whoa, no, wait a minute. We have to reassess with this. And reassessing for them takes 3 months. And by that time, something else has happened. I just haven't figured out
I'm with you. So there's no perfect answer, which, already intuitively having gone through that. So then what you start to do is like create like actions or things that you do to guard against that. So like in that specific instance, let's say you're in your land act design underwriting phase, the deal looks good, your due diligence is coming up positive, the city's, good, your pro forma works, right? Let's say you even talked to equity and equity's like, yeah, I look good, because this will be applicable to equity too. Then you go into your entitlement phase and that's discretionary, like, planning commission, city council, public hearings, and CD plan check, which is non-discretionary. That could take, entitlements could be anywhere from 0 to 2 years. And then CD and plan check in California is about 6 to 8 months. So that's a pretty known time period. So all along that entire way, I'm checking with equity and debt constantly. How you looking? You still like it? Hey, here's a quick update, temperature checking, whatever the narrative that you have for like why you're checking back. I think most investors would appreciate it. Most lenders would probably appreciate it. And what you're guarding against is, do they change? Have they changed their mind? And I sense that you may have like waited and, fine, we've all gone through this. You just learn not to wait as long, right? And so you're sort of checking, and also give yourself, like I call it optionality. And so have 3 or 4 equity investors, have 10, have 100, and then lenders, you won't get that many, but have 3 or 4 or 5 lenders that you're talking to all at the same time. So if one of them craps out on you, you've still got 3 left that are feeling good. I mean, we're in a really weird, you guys know this, we're in an unusual time in the market cycle where a lot of lenders have pulled back because of interest rates and, bank, how well their financials are given, treasury holdings, that kind of thing. So we're in a unique time period, but I would do this all the time, because what you're guarding against is any one individual bank or equity investor crapping out on you, and then you're stuck, right? You've got, you got only one, and then like the SEALs say this. I'm not a SEAL, but I have people that are friends, for them, 2 is 1. So if I got 2 flashlights, that really means I got 1 flashlight, and 1 is none. Right. So if I got one lender, that's really like having zero lenders. And so this is a good like lesson to carry forward with you, to have develop lending relationships early and get and build yourself a good network of them, like build yourself a powerful, broad network of lenders in this instance. And then you're sending the deal to 3 or 4, have debt funds, have commercial banks, have, all kinds of different lenders. And then you want to like get feedback from 3 or 4 that they are all on board. It sounds good. And then you keep pinging them regularly. And then when you get to the end, you're going to have to choose one, but I would rather choose one and tell 3 no than have one that disappeared on me. And then I'm stuck. And
Have you had,
yeah, go for it.
Those different parties ask for exclusivity during the underwriting period? Like I've run into that a few times. I didn't know if I was doing it incorrect, like I obviously wanted these guys to underwrite it, but part of the paperwork was like,
yeah, it's rare.
Else.
It's a great question, Jared. It's rare. And I would generally, in like where I'm at in, how our company operates, I would tell them, look, I get that. I can't give you exclusivity. And then you tell them why. You go, hey, I love you guys, but the banking, I'm gonna give you narrative, you craft as you want. Hey, I understand exclusivity, but hey, look, we're so early, it doesn't make sense to be exclusive. And gosh, enough time's going to go by, development projects, Mr. Lender, you've been through this process, things will change. And gosh, you guys might even change your mind. And then I'm exclusive to you. And so like, you just, sort of talk your way out of it. And look, I would say if a lender's really hardcore and they won't talk to you unless you go exclusive, it's too high risk for you. Like you would say no, and you go, look, gosh, I love you, but man, that's too risky for me. Like, what if, you decide to get out of the market and I'm like, I've worked with you exclusively and then I'm hung out to dry. Because I promise you, and you've seen this probably, Jared, lenders will have no problem hanging you out to dry. They were like, yeah, sorry, man, I'm out. Yeah, sorry, wish I could help you, but my committee said, because it won't be the guy who promised you like he loved your deal and would do it. It's the committee or the bank president, some third party, not the guy or the gal. And they'll be like, oh, I'm so sorry. I know you told me you were exclusive, Mr. Lender. I know I did. And if it was me, I'd do your deal, Jared. But gosh, my committee said no.
Absolutely.
Dude, I've had that conversation many times. Don't want to ever be there if you can help it. Great question. All right, who else?
This is gonna be California specific, Scott, but do you guys do density bonus for your projects, or do you not need to?
Yeah, we do. We use it. In fact, it's a tool we've been using more and more, particularly if it's a great fit for our workforce housing projects. But it's a tool to sort of smooth out the rough edges of the zoning process or underwriting with the city and how they see the project. And then we actually invoke it quite often because in our 5-bedroom unit, the parking standards for 5 bedrooms, as you can imagine, are either work like okay, but often maybe 30 or 40% of the time, a 5-bedroom unit will calculate with a really wacky parking ratio. Like we did a project in Bellflower, we didn't end up moving forward with it, but on a 5-bedroom unit, we had to get 6 parking spaces per unit. All had to be enclosed in a garage, right, under their code requirements in the zoning code. And I told them I could do that's crazy. I've never we've had some 4-bed or 4-space parking calculations, but most top out at 3. So we use that like constantly.
Okay, and is the way you address that discounting some of your 5 beds, or are you offering smaller bedroom count product? Yeah. So it's like more naturally affordable.
So what we've been doing, it's a great question. What we've been doing is we'll pair up a Section 8 voucher family in a 5-bedroom unit. So we restrict the 5-bedroom to the low or very low income that's needed for the density bonus. And then we'll go out and we'll find a 5-bedroom voucher tenant. And I really love that process for 2 reasons. One is if you're a family that has a 5-bedroom voucher in the Section 8 system, it is almost impossible to find a 5-bedroom unit generally, and then a 5-bedroom unit that wants to rent to a Section 8 family. And we can't, we're under, California law to not, discriminate against Section 8 tenants. But gosh, we know people do it all the time, functionally, it's not actually or on writing, but they just don't choose that family, right? Mm-hmm. So we get to basically house families that have a very, very hard time. The turn back ratio, and I'm probably not using the terminology right, but when a family gets a Section 8 voucher, they're usually on a waiting list that's like 10 years long. So they get
Wow.
this voucher, right? And if it's a 5-bedroom voucher, it's like very rare to even have 5 bedrooms available at all. If they don't find a unit within a certain amount of time, they have to turn the voucher back in. They lose it. Like, hey, your voucher's no good anymore. And so we're solving a huge issue in a family housing environment. But the other thing, there's a benefit for us as the developer, is that even though it's a rent restricted to the low income unit, let's say like we had a project in Orange County or Fullerton, the covenant rent or the affordable rent under the affordable housing agreement was like $1,100 a month, as I recall. But when we took a Section 8 voucher tenant there, they still have to income qualify. But in this case, I think it was a 4-bedroom unit, it was a $3,000 a month voucher rent, of which the tenant paid $75 a month. That was their share of the Section 8 rent. And then the Orange County Housing Authority covered the balance. So that $3,000 a month comes into the project as revenue, is like more, almost triple the 1,100 that we would have charged under it's like non-Section 8. So
Wow.
we really solved two really intractable problems, like amazingly well. We housed a great family, and then we helped the underwriting of the project. We do
Oh,
that
awesome.
now. We do
Thank
that
you.
in every project that we have a density bonus, affordable housing component. We'll always put a Section 8 family in there.
Thanks.
Yep.
Scott, do you start your phase one, like, is that like when the property's like under contract or something? Yeah, and you'll write a contract contingency there, and then you decide whether you want to go with the purchase or not, usually?
Yeah, we'll always have a due diligence period. Like that's usually open escrow, and then you immediately start the due diligence period. And so typically our due diligence period, Pete, is 90 days.
Right.
And that's the time period where we go do the soils and the phase one, and we'll do a market study. We'll do a density analysis. We'll even talk with and maybe even submit on an informal basis plans to the city. So we want to answer all those threshold questions I talked about in the answer I gave to Jared. We want to get all those questions answered, so that at the end of the due diligence period, typically you will, let's say we put up 100K in escrow, and when escrow opened, we deposited wired money in for 100K. That creates the escrow in the contract, right? And the due diligence period starts at the end of the 90 days, depending on the contract, PSA, purchase sale agreement provisions. We're obligated to approve due diligence and then pass that 100K through to the seller as like due diligence, escrow, deposit, pass through, non-refundable money. And then that, keeps us going in the contract. We want to make sure that 100K is probably the most important money in the deal, which we need to decide around. Now, the due diligence money is a sunk cost at that point, but we're sort of like, hey, that's why we keep the costs low, right? In my earlier answer to Jared, like we want to keep that as skinny as possible, because we know that money's lost no matter what, right? So if phase one comes back dirty, we're done. Like, we spent 50K, we know that, we're out, we're not going to get that money back. But that 100K, when we've approved due diligence, like that's like super important money for us and of course our investors. And so we'll need to make sure that all of our answers are yes, all of our lights are green for due diligence. That at that point, there is no factor in the project that could keep us from moving forward, right? Any one thing that is threshold and is a no, then we're done. All lights green at that point in time, then we pass through. Now that still doesn't mean the deal works, because in Jared's example, we could go through our entitlement period, for 180 days after the 90 days. We get to the end, we get our approvals, we go to the bank, and the bank's like, oh, I'm not lending anymore. Or equity says, gosh, I loved your deal 6 months ago, but I don't like it now. Or rents have decreased, or construction costs have gone up, or interest rates have gone up, or lending parameters, LTV, loan to value, loan to costs have changed. So there's still a lot of risk after that, but you want to make sure that that threshold basis of decision-making due diligence is complete and all green lights go.
Right. So the one you showed us was an industrial property. Do you sometimes like get like something that's already has you know, already existing built and you just demolish it and build something new there, that you can do much better with the property, like it's underbuilt for the zoning, or it's you can make it more dense, or
Yeah.
something newer, get higher rents, that kind of thing?
Yeah, all the above, but then we have preferences within all those choices. I mean, it's basically infinite, Pete, right? For zoning plus what's on the site, but there's sort of some general buckets you can think of. If it's got a viable occupied commercial or industrial or multifamily or retail, usually it's going to be too expensive for us because the underlying value of that asset, given the existing use, is
Right.
exceeds what we want to pay for it. And that may be California, but I think for most markets that, you know, like if it's got multifamily on it at all, we will never tear it down because we'll have to pay way more than it's worth to develop it. And we're in California where evictions and, you know, that whole process
Yeah.
is like crazy, right? So that's one, you know, bucket of sites. The other bucket of sites typically would be either empty land, right? That's either needs zoning to be amended or it has zoning, or it's highly underutilized, right? So we did one in Fullerton, the one I mentioned earlier. That was a old junky house on a big R3 zoned lot. Like that was that's like a great, you know, like example. And we're always looking for those. Like I'm telling my land ec team, hey, look for the underutilized site. So it'd be, you know, retail that's really badly managed and struggling, and so the value's depressed, and then it's a chance for to buy it. Now, of course, if you know compete with the retail guy, they'll probably beat you. Or it's derelict, you know, so the house in that Fullerton site would, you know, super run down. And so they were sort of selling it, you know, almost no value to the house. Mostly it was land value at that point in time. So those are two extremes on the spectrum, and then there's sort of everything
Right.
in between.
Okay.
Who else?
Got another question for you, Scott. How are you pricing in risk for entitlements, like, you know, by right versus going through the conditional use permit versus something more involved? Is there a point in time where you just say this isn't worth the headaches?
Yeah, our our first priority is we will never close a site unentitled. And so, and then you go, okay, well, what are the entitlements? Well, obviously every site will be different. So the way to think of that, Matthew, is discretionary entitlements. Anything where the city council, i.e. the political bodies, including planning commission, have a say and they can tell you no and shut you down, that's discretionary, or I might say fully discretionary, right? And we're at total, you know, at subject to and, you know, affected by the political process. And so we just, as a rule, don't ever close land unentitled. We want to have those entitlements. So what we'll do in that situation, is we'll structure the due diligence and escrow periods to conform with the idea or the logic for what the time to get the entitlements is. So like we have some deals that, you know, we think the entitlements are going to be 18 months out, like a heavy lift, big site, big number of units, slow city. And so we know that it's 18 months. So we're negotiating all the land contracts to conform with that 18-month period. And then we'll even get extensions beyond that, just in case something goes crazy in that political process, which it always does. Right. So we even get, you know, we'll be 18 months plus 6 months of extensions beyond that. You don't want to get to that 18-month and you're going to have your public hearing like the next month. And the land seller's like, great, you know, you're coming up for city council next month, sucker, like pay up, right? I'll extend. You don't want to be in that position. The other end of the, you know, the time period is like what I call a by right site, or commonly is called a by right site, which means all the zoning works. You have to ask no permission. There is no discretion. They can't legally say no. I mean, in California, they can mess with you a lot. So there really is no true by right anymore. You know, we would shorten that time period up. So we have a couple sites that we're working on now. In fact, we just got tied up under LOI where, you know, we got the 90 days of due diligence, and then we think we can do a lot of work in the, like talking with the city. Hey, the zoning works, but how do you feel about the design? Do you like it? You know, all those kind of things, and get a like clear answer. And then we would close 60 days after the 90 days. And so we have a much shorter time period where we might do 90 days plus 12 months after, if it's a long entitlement process. And then we'll still do extensions. We always do extensions, and the extensions can run anywhere from 3 minimally 3 30-day extensions where we're depositing a little bit each month to get by each extension. And, you know, we've got one deal right now that I think has got 5 or 6 30-day extensions that just happen to be functionally the seller is more comfortable for us to pay up for extensions. That worked fine. Okay, cool. Who else?
Do you guys consider seller financing on your projects?
You know, I've been going down a rabbit hole the last few months. I love the idea. We do forms of seller financing. So we do something called a land joint venture. It's not financing in the classic way that people think of it, but we'll have a landowner participate their land ownership and value into a new partnership. Like they bring the land to the new partnership. We bring all the other components and then we JV the deal together. That's a land JV. We've never done seller financing in the way that like I think classical would be known. I'm not, you know, I think we could do it. But we really need where our goal is always to minimize all upfront costs while we're going through entitlements. Right. So we don't want to buy the land and then even if the payments were good payments, because then we bought land that is maybe not entitled. Well, again, we won't do that. Right. So that hasn't shown up for us a lot to do classic seller financing. It's more like we're getting a patient seller in a long-term escrow or option agreement, or we got the land JV in a development scenario. We're doing ground up. Those would be the classic two that you see. I'm not saying, Mark, it's not like I totally love the idea of trying to, you know, facilitate it. You know, one thing you could do is, you know, like you could do it like a lease option, right? Where you lease the land, right? So if you know, let's say you need to entitle it, you lease it, you make the payments small. And then at the end of the day, if the city says no, then you just terminate the lease and you're out, but you still have the option to buy it. So that's one that I've been thinking about more recently. So that's, you know, we're pretty limited so far, but I'm always trying to think of ways to innovate that. So love it. Love the idea of it.
What's the structure on a JV you typically propose?
On a land JV?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's all totally negotiable. I would just think of like the last 2 or 3 that we worked on. I think we had a family that owned some land. It was like a family office here in LA. It actually has a site they owned in Long Beach in our hometown. I think we ended up that their land. So in that case, so in land JVs in California, the land value often, in fact, almost, you know, 100% of the time is not enough equity value. So when they participate their land into the deal, that land value counts as equity towards the financing structure, like think equity and down payment with the lender. But often the cost of the deal exceed the equity requirements. So in other words, the equity is bigger than the land equity. And so in that case, that was a family office and they own land. I think they did equity plus the land. I think it was 60% to them on the back end, 40% to us. And we did everything else, including doing the loan guarantees, all the entitlements, you know, all the upfront costs, that kind of thing. You know, we see 50-50 quite often. So it varies. It usually doesn't go much below 50. And the real question mark is where's that equity gap come from? So if you have to go raise it from a third party, like an outside equity investor who's not the land JV equity, that usually gets costly in my experience. And so then you'd have to push the land, you know, JV equity partner down and us too, usually. So I think in some instances we've been like, you know, it like got like a, you know, 40 to land JV, 40 to us, and, you know, 20 to the outside equity. I mean, it's totally infinite number of ways to negotiate it, but that's typically how I've seen it.
It sounded like you were hesitant to bring in an outside equity in a situation like that. Is that just because it's less appealing to the JV to have someone sitting on top of them?
Both parties, both the land JV equity and the outside equity, it's like, I mean, it's no different than a syndication, right? Where you're getting 3 or 4 people, hey, you know, join your thing. So often, like 80% of the time, the objection comes from the landowner. Because here's the thing, you know, this is true. Like, you know, if you guys follow Casey Merkley on the, you know, he like, it's always the conversation with the landowner and they're a wacky bunch, right? And so it's a hard thing to talk a landowner into, hey, pair up with me, JV. So you've already sort of stretched them a little bit. And then you go, oh, by the way, I got to have another equity investor that you don't know. And they're like, well, dude, I know you, and maybe we built some trust, but I don't know who's this other party. And I have to answer at the time, I don't know who it is. We'll go out and raise the money. And so that'll be unknown. So it's sort of, they're already often stretched in the land JV structure already. So it ends up where that works out is just time, right? To not be in a rush, to, build comfort, have them even be part of the process. And, and I'm really upfront. I go, look, great. We've struck the land JV structure. This is great, wonderful. But in the initial set of numbers, I would have disclosed them already that there was an equity gap. And I will usually say to them, look, the best person to solve that is you, because, you'll get more of the back end. You're already in the ownership position. So there's a natural fit there. But often they go, well, look, I don't want to put any cash into it. And I go, okay, that I totally understand. So just know that we're in that mode now. I'm going to have to go out and, either I'll put up more money. We do that sometimes, or we'll raise third party. And so usually we're already sort of stepping them along in the process. But, land sellers being who they are, they're often, sole proprietors, have always done it their own sort of maverick style. And so it's just, a little bit more time to, get them over the hump.
And do you wait to form that other entity where they are bringing their land until the entire due diligence process, so that if, something came up towards the tail end, they would retain the land again? Like they're not, it hasn't been already dedicated to this, other company.
Right. Great way to think of it. We'll wait until the latest we can in that, sort of call it a disposition or transfer of the land into the new LLC. Then comes the question of who puts up the pursuit cost, right? Who puts up the, of course, these land sellers, they never have phase ones, they never have soils, they've done no, architectural studies. And if they did do them, they're not useful to us because it's a different product type.
It's almost a nice lure to try to talk them into a JV though, right?
Yeah.
It's like, hey, if at the very least, you'll get all this extra information you can put on the listing.
Yeah,
if we don't
find
end up
out
doing
what
it.
this thing's worth, like what could an asset when completed look like? But also there's some other, and you bring up an interesting point, like the biggest sort of part of the sales conversation is like, look, it's a non-tax, you transferring the land to the JV is a non-taxable event. First off, like, so if a seller's really tax sensitive, the JV is a natural fit, right? They convey the land, it's a non-taxable event. And then any uplift they get in the development process valuation, that's of course not taxable either. And then the sort of keystone of it is I go, hey, look, and most often will try to have these land JV structures with long-term holds, right? That's like a good fit, philosophically for us and this land seller. Hey, let's build it and we'll do it together and then we'll own it forever, right? That's sort of the general picture. And then if we do a refi, later on, 3-5 years out, whatever the time period is, then that's all tax-free as well. So there's a lot of tax advantage to doing this land JV. The hangup usually is that they have to subordinate their land interest to a new loan, like to the construction loan, and then eventually the perm loan. That usually is the biggest, sort of, like friction point. The other friction point is if they have any existing debt on the land, that's got to be paid off to get the new construction lender in a first TD position. But, I would say probably out of the hundreds of JV offers I've made, I think we've gotten maybe a handful. It's pretty difficult. And I'm not trying to talk you guys out of it. I think it's a great structure. I think many more land sellers should do it than not, sort of in the Casey, creative financing, mentality. Like, but, land sellers often, won't, try to understand, or it's just too complicated and they dismiss it. So it's usually a slow process. One thing I do tell you though, what's great is if you get a land JV in place, even if you haven't transferred the land yet, you would have an agreement up front to like sort of, oh, when these things happen, then we'll do the land JV. So you're, as a developer, you're protected that they don't change their mind later. Is you have usually a very patient land seller or land partner, because always the rub with land sellers is they always want to close as soon as they can. and we want to close as late as we can, right? And we're always in a fight over time. But when you get a land JV that you get structure, at least in principle, where you have a signed agreement to do the future conveyance, you then have a very patient landowner, right? You go, look, it's going to take 12 months to entitle, but you're going to get this great value. And when this thing's built, you get this cash flow and, right. So that's an amazing part of the land JV structure.
If you do have a seller that has a phase one and a soils report, A, will they ever give you access to that? And B, if they do, would you rely on it or do you always get your own?
Yeah. I don't think I've ever had a seller refuse to give it if they have it. It's very rare for them to have it, but when they have, like we have a couple sites we're working on now where it's a professional developer. Like if it's a professional land person, you know, title and flip, or another developer who may just sell the entitlements, those guys, they know, because it helps us get comfortable faster, which gets them to a faster close. So they'll just always share it. On the reliance part, it depends on the complexity of the report and its findings. And then who is it who gave the report, like the original vendor. Whenever we can, we'll always try to get a reliance letter, which basically is a letter that says, when you use this report, although we commissioned it for another party, this reliance letter transfers the reliance of you, the new developer, on this data, right? Like the vendor says to us, you can rely on this report, and they'll write it in our name. And particularly who will want to see that, I mean, of course, is us first. Like we want to have that reliance capability. We want to know there's like a legal connection between the report and us as the developer, but also any equity investor who's sophisticated and wants to see that, but particularly lenders, you know, they'll want that. So in the case of, you know, like if you had a report, you try to take to a lender and it was in somebody else's name, the lender will reject it. You know, they'll go, it's like, it's not your partnership or whatever, your development company name. That's like a functional, like absolute requirement to get that reliance letter. And then, you know, we've had, you know, situations where we had existing reports and we decided that we didn't feel good enough about them. So we'll have our own consultants do a report. Sometimes what you can do is sort of like a peer review, where you'll have like your soils guy look at their soils report. You don't have the reliance from the legal underlying data, but sometimes you can reuse the data, and maybe, you know, the new soils report is less expensive, or it can be done faster because there's already a lot of data existing, like even the whole write-up and the maps. I mean, another vendor can use all that data. They'll still probably go out and do their own additional borings just to, you know, be doubly sure, but there's some cost savings potentially there as well.
Okay.
Okay, who else?
Curious if you could speak to, you mentioned you have a fund, you started a fund. I'm curious if you can speak to sort of how you're putting these deals together, the capital stack, and how much leverage you're going for with the banks, or the banks looking to give you these days.
Yeah. So our latest equity fund is going to be around 75 million, probably be 400 units of, and the first fund and the second fund are all our UTH model. So we don't do any third-party projects, and we only do this particular project type and product type. Basically right now our underwriting for debt and equity is 60-40. So we're using a 60% LTC on the construction loan and 40% equity. That's pretty conservative historically. But that's the lending environment today. Our analysis, and, you know, we work with groups like Walker Dunlop, we work with JLL, we work with some smaller boutique shops who basically have lender relationships, and they'll go, we'll commission them and we'll go, hey, you know, Kevin McKenzie at JLL, go find us a construction loan. Here's basically how we're underwriting it. You know, go find us, you know, as many lenders and the best choices you can. And so right now the flavor of like the environment today is a lot of commercial banks are out of construction lending totally. A few starting to creep back in, but almost all of them went out, right? And then there's a few stragglers, and they went out. And even like 2 months ago, you would say almost all commercial banks that I'm aware of, that we know, that have worked with historically or even have heard about, are totally out of the construction loan market. And just in the last month or two, we're starting to see a few creep back in. You know, banks, you know, make the majority of their money on construction lending. If they do construction lending, the fees and the interest on those are very accretive to their bottom lines. So in a way, banks can't hold out for too long. You know, I mean, if the regulators are crawling down their, throats, then usually they'll back off and then, start to come back in and regrow that portfolio. So that leaves the market a big vacuum in the market over the last several months. A lot of debt funds have come into that space. So these are funds themselves that lend money privately, obviously not commercial banking. We're starting to see some structures where it'll be like a commercial bank that'll loan at like 40% LTV or LTC, and then they stack a mezz piece on top of that, and they'll get up to like 70 or 75% of the capital stack at a blended rate of like 10. The mezz piece is more expensive. The first trustee lending money is, lower rates. The blended's 10. And then we're talking to some life cos right now that will do construction to perm. And we really like that. Our workforce housing deals, we want to hold a little bit longer in the portfolio once they're developed. And so instead of selling them immediately, like, merchant build style, we'll hold them for, maybe 3 to 4 years to try to grow the value and the rent stream, the NOI stream. And so we don't want to get a full tilt perm loan, particularly with today's underwriting on perm lending. It's like hurtful to the capital stack on the perm loan side. And so what we'll do is we'll do a construction to perm with a life co, where anybody would do that, where they'll basically loan, they underwrite the construction sort of under this like 60-65% LTC that I spoke about, but then we'll, sort of automatically convert to a perm loan with, lower interest rate on that for whatever that stabilized period is. But it's just a conversion from the original construction loan amount to a permanent loan amount. No other change. I mean, sometimes there's a little bit uptick or downtick, but we try to limit that, right? We always want to have an easy conversion over, and we just sort of go, hey, we stabilize, we're 90 days at 90% occupancy, go, and then our interest rate drops. That the main benefit is to get a lower interest rate in the perm loan period. So we're starting to do, I'm advising, our team and our partners, like we want to go to that structure almost exclusively. But then the market of construction, offers, for lenders and life cos is less also because they sort of backed out and are coming back in. So there's a smaller group of those. Does that answer your question, Daryl?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, great. All right, guys. Well, listen, I appreciate it. It's getting on 1 o'clock. So, I'm going to post this, like I said, in the comments, and, certainly hit me up and, on Twitter or in the DMs on Twitter. That's a great way to reach me, and, appreciate everybody joining today. Thanks for hanging out.
Yeah, thanks,
So
Scott.
much, Scott.
All right, everybody have a good
Thanks,
holiday.
Scott.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah, man.
Thanks all. Appreciate it.
Thanks for doing this, Scott.
Yeah,
Scott, when
appreciate
do you
it.
think you'll post it on YouTube?
Say again?
When do you think you'll post it on YouTube? You said?
Look, given the holidays, I look for it probably the week after Christmas.
Got it. Okay.
I'm light on video editing staff given the holidays, so but we'll get it up soon. Yeah.
And on Twitter, same thing or sooner?
Probably you'll start to see excerpts on Twitter, and then the full length. I mean, I guess with this length, I guess we could still put it on Twitter, but I think it's excerpts on Twitter, and then the full tilt post will be on the Real Estate Development 101 learning space, and then on YouTube.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you, Scott.
All right.
Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
guys.